Caracas does not sleep, it trembles. In the early hours of January 3, 2026, the Venezuelan capital lies under a heavy, humid sky, its hills dotted with fragile chains of yellow light where the poorest barrios cling to the slopes. Around 2 o'clock local time, that fragile calm fractures. Distant thunder rolls in from the coast, but it is not a storm. It is the sound of jet engines. High above the Caribbean, more than 100 American aircraft carve invisible corridors through the night, their running lights killed, their presence masked beneath the background noise of a restless city. Tankers, bombers, drones, electronic warfare platforms, an armada that has not been seen over Latin America in generations, hold station, waiting for a single word from distant command posts in Florida and Washington. On the ground, the first explosions bloom around Caracas like sudden violent suns, hammering military installations, air defenses, and communication hubs. Windows rattle in apartment blocks, car alarms scream, power flickers and dies in whole districts as transformers fail. In the confusion beneath the roar of jets and the crack of distant detonations, a much smaller force moves. Low and fast helicopters cross the city, hugging the contours of the valley, rotors chopping the warm night air. Inside, Delta Force operators sit strapped in, night vision lenses glowing, and gloved hands resting on weapons and tools designed not to conquer a country, but to take one man alive. Their target is a fortress-like safe house in the heart of the capital, a place they have rehearsed assaulting again and again on a full-scale replica, thousands of kilometers away. At that same moment, in a secure room far from Caracas, the President of the United States monitors the unfolding assault. Having already given the most consequential order of his second term, launch Operation Absolute Resolve. And as the helicopters descend toward the compound where Nicolás Maduro believes steel doors and loyal guards will keep the world at bay, the story of how this night became possible reaches back years into Venezuela's collapse. Washington's frustrations and a long, dangerous evolution in American power. Under Hugo Chavez, Venezuela reimagined itself as the vanguard of a new Latin American socialism, financed by one of the largest proven oil reserves on Earth. When Chavez died in 2013 and his chosen successor, Nicolás Maduro, narrowly won the presidency, the promise of that revolution was already eroding under the weight of mismanagement, corruption, and mounting authoritarianism. Oil production was declining, infrastructure was aging, and the state had become increasingly dependent on high crude prices to fund sprawling social programs and political patronage. By the middle of the 2010s, the global oil market turned against Caracas. Prices fell, foreign investment dried up, and a state that had once projected confidence and generosity now struggled to keep. Supermarket shelves stocked and hospital lights on. Hyperinflation shattered savings. Salaries lost value in days. Millions of Venezuelans joined an exodus that spilled into neighboring Colombia, Brazil, and far beyond. For those who remained, daily life narrowed into queues, blackouts, and an ever-present fear of crime and repression. Maduro's answer was not reform but consolidation. Security forces and loyalist collectivos were tasked with suppressing protest, dismantling independent institutions, and intimidating opponents. Elections grew less competitive, courts more compliant, and the legislature became a battleground as the government worked to neutralize opposition majorities. International observers, human rights organizations, and much of the Venezuelan diaspora increasingly described the system not as flawed democracy, but as entrenched authoritarian rule. In Washington, this transformation was not ignored. As early as 2015, the United States began targeting Venezuelan officials involved in human rights abuses and anti-democratic actions with a new wave of sanctions. Moving beyond earlier measures tied mainly to narcotics, when Maduro claimed re-election in a 2018-2019 process, widely denounced as fraudulent, the Trump administration took a decisive step, recognizing opposition leader Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's legitimate interim president and tightening economic pressure on the regime. Oil company PDVSA, the state's financial lifeline, became the focus of sanctions designed to strangle revenue and force political change in Caracas. The result was a paradox. Sanctions deepened the economic crisis, increasing hardship for ordinary Venezuelans. Maduro endured, relying on loyal security services, support from allies such as Russia, China, and Cuba, and the fragmentation of the opposition. Inside the U.S. national security establishment, patience began to fray as years passed without a clean resolution. Then came 2019 and the Guaido uprising, a moment when it briefly appeared that the regime might crack. Military defections and mass street demonstrations raised expectations in Washington and among Venezuelan exiles that a peaceful transition could be at hand. But the decisive shift did not come. Maduro held the loyalty of key military and intelligence units, thanks in part to purges, patronage, and the quiet backing of foreign advisors. Guaido's parallel government, recognized abroad, never secured real control over territory or the security apparatus at home, and ultimately dissolved in 2023. The failures of that period left deep marks. For Maduro, surviving the Guaido challenge confirmed the resilience of his network and the possibility of outlasting foreign pressure. For us policymakers, it highlighted the limits of sanctions and diplomacy when facing a regime willing to absorb extraordinary costs to remain in power. Within defense and intelligence circles, officers who had watched the crisis unfold over more than a decade began to re-examine older precedents. Panama in 1989, Libya in 2011, and more recent targeted strike campaigns that blended covert and overt tools. By the early 2020s, as Venezuela's humanitarian crisis dragged on and regional partners struggled with refugee flows and cross-border criminal networks, pressure for a more decisive approach tightened. Reports and policy briefs in Washington parsed the growing influence of organized crime groups like Tren de Aragua, the role of Venezuela as a hub for illicit trafficking, and the risks of allowing a failing authoritarian petrostate to fester indefinitely on the hemisphere's northern coast. The question was no longer whether Maduro's rule was sustainable in moral or economic terms, but whether the United States and its allies would tolerate its continuation. As debates intensified, a different conversation began to unfold in classified rooms, away from press conferences and public statements. Sanctions had been tested. Covert political support had been tested. Indirect pressure through regional partners had been tested. What remained was the most controversial option: the direct use of American force not to invade and occupy a country, but to reach into its capital and remove a sitting head of state. This is where the story of Operation Absolute Resolve truly begins, with a superpower weighing the risks of crossing a line it had rarely dared to cross in Latin America since the Cold War, and with a Venezuelan leader convinced that his security apparatus and foreign backers would shield him from the full reach of American power. In late 2025, what had long been a simmering standoff between Washington and Caracas shifted into something far more volatile. By then, years of sanctions and diplomatic isolation had not dislodged Nicolás Maduro, but they had hardened perceptions in the United States that Venezuela was no longer just an internal tragedy, but a security problem radiating outward through migration, narcotics, and alliances with U.S. adversaries. Intelligence assessments circulating in Washington increasingly framed Maduro's Venezuela as a hub where criminal networks, foreign security services, and sanctioned state interests intersected. Within this context, the Trump administration's second term moved toward a more aggressive doctrine for the Western Hemisphere. Building on years of pressure, the White House and key advisors authorized expanded covert CIA activities inside Venezuela, including operations that pushed beyond traditional intelligence sharing into more direct action against regime-linked targets. Covert maritime interdictions and strikes on suspected trafficking networks near Venezuelan waters signaled a willingness to take lethal measures even before the world knew the full extent of the plan. At the same time, U.S. law enforcement indictments against Maduro and senior officials on narco-terrorism and corruption charges provided a legal framework for a more drastic step. The State Department's reward offer for information leading to Maduro's arrest, tens of millions of dollars posted publicly, made clear that Washington no longer saw him merely as an unfriendly head of state, but as a wanted criminal. Behind closed doors, senior national security officials debated whether that designation could justify a direct operation to seize him, not unlike the capture of Manuel Noriega in Panama in 1989, but adapted to a new era of precision warfare and pervasive surveillance. In the months before January 2026, U.S. military posture around Venezuela began to change in subtle ways. Refueling tankers, intelligence, and surveillance aircraft, and electronic warfare platforms were quietly rotated into positions that would later allow large-scale strike packages to assemble quickly over the Caribbean without warning. Naval assets in the region conducted what appeared to be routine exercises and counter-narcotics patrols, but they also mapped radar coverage, air corridors, and potential search and rescue contingencies along Venezuela's coast. The CIA, meanwhile, focused on the most sensitive part of the equation, where Maduro slept, how he moved, and who around him could be turned. Satellite imagery, signals, intercepts, informants, and drone surveillance contributed to what intelligence professionals call pattern of life, a detailed picture of habits and routines that, over time, reveals vulnerabilities. According to later accounts, at least one highly placed source inside the regime provided information that narrowed down the leader's most trusted safe locations in Caracas. Once a specific site was judged reliable, planning shifted from paper to practice. At secret facilities far from Venezuela, Delta Force and other special operators constructed a full-scale mock-up of the safe house believed to shelter Maduro, complete with walls, doors, entry points, and approximated interior layouts. Because they did not know every internal detail, planners varied the structure during rehearsals, forcing assault teams to adapt to different room configurations and potential obstacles. They drilled approaches by air and by ground, rehearsed contingencies for failed breaching charges, hostage scenarios, and last-minute changes in the target's location. Politically, the decision required more than military readiness. A raid to seize a sitting president in his own capital risked escalation with Venezuela's foreign backers. Condemnation at the United Nations and blowback across Latin America, where memories of U.S. interventionism run deep. Yet advocates inside the administration argued that decades of restraint had not prevented hostile actors from entrenching themselves in the hemisphere, and that a controlled, time-limited operation could deliver a decisive blow without the open-ended occupation that characterized past interventions. By late December 2025, the internal argument appears to have been resolved in favor of action. Reporting suggests that the president signed off on authorities that fused CIA intelligence operations with Pentagon strike planning, granting commanders flexibility to respond to fleeting windows of opportunity when Maduro was both positively identified and reachable. Publicly, however, Washington continued to speak the familiar language of sanctions, diplomacy, and concern for democracy, even as air crews, special operators, and intelligence teams worked toward a very different conclusion. Inside Venezuela, the regime sensed mounting pressure but misread its form. Security drills intensified around key installations. Propaganda highlighted foreign threats. Maduro's inner circle alternated between defiant speeches and quiet efforts to explore limited accommodation with parts of the opposition and international community. Few in Caracas, however, anticipated that the United States would risk the outrage of openly striking targets across the country and attempting to physically remove the president from its territory. Still, there were hints. A drone strike on a Venezuelan coastal facility in December, attributed by some reports to U.S. intelligence, suggested that the line of acceptable action was shifting. Regional military watchers noted unusual American aerial activity, and think tanks published speculative pieces about whether the hemisphere was on the verge of its most serious security crisis since the end of the Cold War. All of this built toward a narrow window at the start of 2026, when intelligence streams converged. Maduro's location at a particular fortified compound, his security posture, the readiness of U.S. forces, and a political moment in Washington where the perceived benefits of decisive action outweighed the risks. The decision that followed would unleash more than 150 aircraft, unleash precision strikes across Venezuela, and send a small, meticulously trained assault force into the heart of Caracas. And as that force prepared to move from rehearsal to reality, the story of operation, absolute resolve shifts from the broad canvas of geopolitics to the specific human angles of the people who would execute, experience, and endure the raid. In the neighborhoods that cling to the hills above Caracas, Operation Absolute Resolve arrived first as sound. People woke to the roar of engines and the concussive thud of strikes in a city already conditioned by years of blackouts, shortages, and sudden outages to expect the worst when the lights flickered. Families who had long learned to store water in buckets, To keep a small reserve of food and to live with the constant hum of generators now peered through curtains at flashes on the horizon, unsure whether this was another failure of the grid or the beginning of war. For many Venezuelans, the shock of that night layered onto a decade of slow, grinding collapse. Salaries had been eaten by inflation, medicine had become a luxury. Entire professions had emptied as millions left the country on foot and by bus. Those who remained navigated a daily landscape of queues, improvised markets, and improvisation just to keep refrigerators running through rolling power cuts. When explosions sounded from military bases and air defenses around Caracas, some residents filmed the distant fireballs with phones they could barely afford to charge, posting images before the networks buckled under the strain. Inside the capital, there were also people whose lives had been bound directly to the Maduro government and its security apparatus. Soldiers and National Guard personnel on duty that night felt the ground shake beneath them as runways, radar stations, and command posts were struck, their training suddenly colliding with the reality of facing a vastly superior air armada. In some units, confusion and contradictory orders spread as communications were severed, and commanders tried to understand whether this was a limited strike, a coup, or the opening phase of invasion. For them, the human angle of Operation Absolute Resolve was not an abstract debate about sovereignty, but a desperate effort to survive in exposed positions under precision fire. Far from the blast radius, in secure facilities where the operation had been rehearsed for months, the night carried a different weight. Delta Force operators and support personnel had spent countless hours moving through the mock-up of Maduro's safe house, drilling not just the mechanics of breaching and clearing, but the rhythm and timing of working as a single organism in tight spaces. They had internalized floor plans, practiced navigating under low light and simulated smoke, and memorized likely locations for the principal target and his close protection detail. In their world, the human dimension of the raid involved not only the enemy and civilians on the ground, but their own families, fully aware that the mission's political profile meant any failure or capture would echo far beyond a standard special operations disaster. Behind that tactical edge stood a thinner, quieter line: the intelligence officers and local assets who had made it possible to know with sufficient confidence where Maduro would be when the helicopters arrived. A small CIA team on the ground had spent months building an image of his daily routine, watching movements in and out of key compounds, and cross-checking reports against satellite passes and electronic intercepts. Somewhere close to the president, an undisclosed source relayed updates that could cost a life if exposed, feeding into the final confirmation that justified risking American operators in the heart of Caracas. For these individuals, Operation Absolute Resolve was lived as a chain of quiet decisions under extreme pressure: when to report, what to conceal, and how to balance personal survival against the magnitude of the mission. And all through that night, ordinary Venezuelans, supporters and opponents of the regime alike, watched the sky, listened to the explosions, refreshed social media timelines that crashed and recovered, and tried to understand whether the country's long crisis had just taken a turn toward liberation, occupation, or something in between. From the tactical angle, Operation Absolute Resolve was designed as a short, violent incision rather than a prolonged campaign. Delta Force operators were ferried into the target area by 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment helicopters flying low and fast. Under cover from layers of U.S. fighters, bombers, and drones that had already begun suppressing Venezuelan defenses. Their mission profile emphasized speed, surprise, and overwhelming localized firepower. Reach the safe house, breach, locate Maduro and his wife Cilia Flores, and extract them before the regime's remaining forces could regroup. To account for heavy metal doors and reinforced structures, some operators carried specialized breaching tools, including blowtorches and explosive charges tested repeatedly during rehearsals. The technological angle of the operation stretched far beyond the men in the helicopters and the munitions falling on radar sites. U.S. planners integrated satellite surveillance, signals intelligence, AI-assisted pattern analysis, and electronic warfare to reduce uncertainty about Maduro's location and blind Venezuelan defenses at critical moments. Cyber capabilities reportedly targeted elements of the national power grid and communications systems, contributing to blackouts that shrouded parts of Caracas and degraded command and control just as the strike packages arrived. In the final hours before launch, machine-assisted tools helped fuse disparate data streams into a high-confidence assessment that the target was inside the designated compound, giving the political leadership a narrower but more solid footing for authorizing the raid. From the leadership angle in Washington, the decision to proceed with Operation Absolute Resolve crystallized around a reinterpreted understanding of legitimacy in law. Officials close to President Trump argued that because the United States did not recognize Maduro as Venezuela's legitimate leader, he could be treated not as a protected head of state, but as an indicted criminal subject to arrest even on foreign soil. They framed the mission as an enforcement action tied to U.S. indictments and reward offers, rather than as the beginning of a traditional war requiring formal congressional authorization. Critics in Congress and the legal community would later condemn this reasoning. But in the Situation Room and related briefings, it provided a conceptual bridge between domestic legal constraints and the desire for decisive action. On the enemy's side, the Maduro regime had invested heavily in personal security. Yet those measures proved insufficient against a state willing to combine covert penetration with overt force. The president had reportedly rotated sleeping locations, switched phones frequently, and relied on Cuban-trained bodyguards and counterintelligence officers to reduce the risk of assassination or capture. His residences and safe houses were hardened with layers of fencing, steel doors, and checkpoints, designed to delay intruders long enough for reinforcements to respond. But these defenses were built on the assumption of threats from within Venezuela's own fractured landscape coup attempts. Rogue units or insurgent cells, not a precision raid synchronized with wide-scale airstrikes, and informed by a high-level human source. Running through each of these angles was a stark moral and strategic debate that would only intensify once the mission succeeded. Supporters of the operation contended that years of repression, economic devastation, and criminal entanglements had forfeited any claim Maduro might have had to the protections usually afforded to heads of state, and that removing him in a targeted strike was preferable to either inaction or full-scale war. Opponents warned that the precedent of abducting a sitting leader on foreign soil under the cover of a massive aerial assault eroded norms that had helped restrain great power behavior since the Cold War and opened the door for other states to justify similar actions in their own neighborhoods. All of these threads, tactical precision, technological reach, leadership calculus, and the vulnerabilities of a regime that believed it could outlast external pressure, converged in the moment when orders shifted from planning to execution, and the operation moved toward its decisive turning point in the dark streets of Caracas. In Washington, the decisive order came late. At 23:46, on January 2nd, 2026, President Donald Trump authorized the strikes and the apprehension mission, triggering a cascade of pre-planned actions that rippled outward from secure command centers to pilots already sitting in cockpits and operators waiting beside rotors. Within minutes, encrypted messages and code words confirmed across commands what months of rehearsal had been building toward. Operation Absolute Resolve was no longer a plan, but a scheduled reality. Shortly after 2 o'clock local time in Caracas, the sky over northern Venezuela lit up. Residents near La Guaya Higuerot and other areas close to the capital saw and heard the first wave of explosions as U.S. aircraft struck air defense sites, military bases, and infrastructure nodes designed to blind and disorient the Venezuelan security apparatus. Fort Tuna, a key military complex in Caracas that formed part of the core of the presidential security system, was among the locations rocked by detonations. Under the cover of those impacts, cyber attacks and electronic warfare disrupted communications and contributed to power failures that threw large sections of the city into darkness. Behind that curtain of chaos, the assault force moved. Helicopters from the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment carried Delta Force operators along carefully mapped low-level routes into Caracas, skimming over the terrain to stay under the effective envelope of any remaining air defenses. At roughly 1 o'clock, Eastern Time, around an hour after the first explosions were reported, the aircraft approached the heavily fortified compound believed to house Nicolás Maduro and his wife Cilia Flores. As they neared the target, small arms fire reached up from the ground, and one helicopter was hit, but remained flyable. A reminder that even a degraded opponent could still inflict sudden damage. The target complex itself was no ordinary residence. Located within the broader Fortuna military area, it had been designed as a hardened node in the presidential security architecture. Protected by multiple rings of guards, fences, and steel-reinforced barriers, inside, layers of protection converged. Casa Militar, the elite presidential guard, Cuban intelligence advisors, and, according to some reports, Russian-linked security contractors associated with Wagner-type formations that had been present in Venezuela since the mid-2010s. The compound's internal defenses included steel doors, and what Trump later described as a solid steel safe room. Final fallback intended to shield the president from precisely the kind of direct assault now bearing down on it. For the Delta Force operators stepping off the helicopters into the warm night air, the layout was both familiar and unknown. Familiar, because they had spent weeks rehearsing against a full-scale mock-up built from intelligence and human-sourced detail. Unknown, because real structures never perfectly matched their replicas, and because the defenders were now alert, moving, and firing back. As they established a perimeter and pushed toward the entrances, breaching teams readied explosives and specialized tools, including blowtorches prepared for the possibility of cutting through steel barriers if doors could not be forced quickly enough. Time in such operations is measured in seconds. The longer the team remained outside, the greater the chance that Venezuelan units nearby could organize a counterattack, or that Maduro could retreat deeper into fortified spaces. Once the outer defenses were breached, operators moved rapidly through the compound clearing rooms under low light, calling out identifications over secure radio and following a path that intelligence suggested would lead toward the private quarters where the president was most likely to be found at that hour. Somewhere in those corridors, a line existed between failure, a missed turn, a blocked passage, a delayed breach, and the mission's objective: reaching the man who, until that night, had survived every previous attempt to unseat him, while this was unfolding on the ground. The Situation Room screens in Washington showed live and near real-time feeds, aircraft tracks, battle damage imagery, communications snippets from the assault force. Trump later described watching the raid like a television show, a statement that underscored the distance between the sterile glow of monitors and the chaos inside a darkened compound under attack. Yet those screens also displayed the risks that remained: reports of a hit helicopter, bursts of gunfire, and the ever-present chance that Maduro might have escaped the target area in the confusion before the walls were breached. In Caracas, the turning point approached in the most intimate of spaces, the threshold of a bedroom and the door of a safe room built to keep the outside world away. The last doors in the compound were built to buy time: steel bolts, reinforced frames, layers meant to turn seconds into minutes. Minutes into enough delay for loyal forces to respond, or for a president to disappear deeper into safety. On the night of January 3rd, 2026, they failed to do even that. As Delta Force elements pushed into the inner sections of the safe house, they encountered the obstacles they had trained for in distant, anonymous facilities. Heavy doors were met with precisely placed charges and breaching tools. Operators moved through dust and smoke, clearing rooms in tight formation, calling out when spaces were secure. Somewhere ahead lay the private quarters where intelligence placed Nicolás Maduro and Cilia Flores in every delay, a jammed hinge, a misaligned charge, a confused doorway risked giving the occupants time to run, hide, or reach a hardened safe room. Accounts of the final moments diverge in some details, but converge on a core image: Maduro and his wife being taken from their bedroom before they could disappear behind steel, according to U.S. officials. When the assault team entered the private area, the Venezuelan leader tried to move toward what Trump later described as a steel safe room built inside the residence. He did not make it in time. In a matter of seconds, operators subdued him and Flores, securing their hands with restraints and confirming identities under the green glow of night vision and the harsh white beams of weapon-mounted lights. For the men in that room, the culmination of months of preparation was not triumphant, but procedural. They photographed the detainees, passed confirmation codes over secure channels, and began the process of moving them back out through a structure that was still not entirely safe. Outside, sporadic gunfire crackled from remaining defenders. Somewhere above, the protective canopy of U.S. aircraft and drones maintained watch over the compound, ready to suppress any larger response. Inside, the priorities shifted from breaching to exfiltration, getting to high-value detainees and an entire assault element back to the landing zone and then into the sky. The extraction phase unfolded quickly. With Maduro and Flores under guard, the team retraced their route, moving past shattered frames and spent shell casings, back toward the waiting helicopters whose rotors beat a steady rhythm over the compound. One aircraft that had taken small arms fire remained operational, a testament both to luck and to engineering designed to survive exactly this kind of damage. Within minutes, the detainees were loaded aboard, strapped and guarded, and the formation lifted off into the dark, racing along pre-planned corridors toward international airspace and U.S. naval vessels positioned offshore. At sea, a U.S. amphibious assault ship served as the first major staging point. Images released later showed Maduro in U.S. custody aboard the USS Iwo Jima, in handcuffs, head bowed, dressed in dark clothing, a visual confirmation of what had already been transmitted in coded form from the assault force minutes after the capture. From there, the plan called for rapid transfer onward to the United States, where long-standing federal indictments in New York provided the legal framework for his detention and eventual trial on narcotics and weapons charges. In Washington and at Mar-a-Lago, the line between operation and announcement was crossed almost as quickly as the line between Venezuelan and international airspace. Less than an hour after Maduro was taken into custody, Trump posted a message declaring the mission a success and stating that the Venezuelan leader and his wife had been captured and removed from the country. White House communications soon followed with an image and statements framing the raid as the execution of an arrest warrant against a criminal figure, not an act of conquest against a sovereign state. On the ground in Caracas, the turning point was felt differently. As dawn approached, rumors spread through social media, radio, and word of mouth that the president had been killed, that he had fled, that he had been taken, that the Americans were now in charge. Venezuelan officials first denounced the strikes as an act of war, then struggled to project continuity as it became increasingly clear their leader was no longer in the country. For the United States, the capture marked the climax of Operation Absolute Resolve, the removal of a longtime adversary from his own fortified stronghold. Using a blend of global airpower, clandestine intelligence, and a small group of operators on the ground. For Venezuela and the wider world, however, what happened after the helicopters lifted away from Fort Tuna would prove just as consequential as the raid itself. At street level, the immediate aftermath of Maduro's capture unfolded in a mix of shock, elation, and fear. The night that began with explosions ended with rumors, phone alerts, and the dawning realization that the man who had dominated Venezuelan politics for over a decade was no longer in the country. By morning on January 3rd, Caracas showed two very different faces. In some neighborhoods, particularly those hardest hit by years of shortages and repression, residents emerged cautiously to bang pots, wave flags, and speak often without giving their full names, about a fragile sense of hope that at least Maduro is gone. Others stayed on balconies or behind half-open doors, playing music or cheering quietly, wary that visible celebration could draw attention from armed groups and security forces still loyal to the old order. At the same time, Maduro's supporters mobilized. Pro-government demonstrators gathered near central landmarks and around the remnants of the presidential complex, waving red flags and portraits, denouncing what they called an abduction and demanding their leader's release. Officials from the ruling party framed the raid as proof that Venezuela had been attacked not because it was weak, but because it had defied U.S. power, and urged supporters to remain in the streets. Beyond Venezuela's borders, the diaspora reacted with its own emotions. In South Florida and other hubs of Venezuelan exile communities, spontaneous gatherings formed outside restaurants, plazas, and churches where people sang the national anthem, waved flags, and wept at news that a man they blamed for the collapse of their homeland was now in handcuffs. Signs appeared with slogans linking Maduro's fall to the hope of national rebirth. Even as voices on television and radio reminded viewers that the future of those still inside Venezuela would be shaped by what came next, not just by the image of a captured president. Regionally and globally, the political reaction was swift and polarized. Governments in Brazil, Colombia, under left-leaning leadership, Mexico, and Chile, condemned the strikes and the capture as a violation of sovereignty and the United Nations Charter, warning that a dangerous precedent had been set for armed intervention under the justification of law enforcement. China and Russia demanded Maduro's immediate release and signaled that they viewed the operation as an aggressive escalation in the Western Hemisphere. Yet other leaders, notably Argentina's Javier Milei, El Salvador's Nayib Bukele, and Ecuador's Daniel Noboa, praised the raid as a blow against narco-cavismo and a victory for those who had suffered under the Venezuelan regime. Inside Caracas, the question that began to dominate conversations was simple and unnerving. Who was now in charge? Venezuela's High Court moved quickly to name Vice President Delcy Rodriguez as interim president, asserting constitutional continuity, even as the practical levers of power remained in the hands of military commanders and security chiefs who had just watched their highest protectee taken from a supposedly secure compound. Trump, for his part, publicly stated that the United States would run the country until an acceptable transition could be arranged, implying a role for both Venezuelan institutions and figures within the old regime willing to cooperate. The resulting overlap between a court-appointed interim authority in Caracas and a de facto foreign-controlled transition framework created precisely the ambiguity that many Venezuelans feared. A power vacuum in which decisions might be made simultaneously in local ministries and distant situation rooms. As lines formed outside supermarkets and petrol stations that day, people bought what they could not, knowing whether the strikes would continue, whether new sanctions or blockades were coming, or whether fighting might break out between rival factions of the armed forces. For them, the first hours of the aftermath were not about legal arguments at the United Nations, but about immediate survival in a city that had just become the stage for one of the most audacious military operations of the century. In the days after the raid, global markets reacted with a mixture of caution and surprising restraint. Oil prices swung in the first 24 to 48 hours as traders weighed the risk of conflict in a major oil-producing country against the possibility that a post-Maduro government aligned with Washington could eventually increase output. Benchmark Brent crude moved within a relatively narrow band around $60 to $61 per barrel, while energy stocks in the United States actually rose on expectations that American companies might gain greater access to Venezuelan reserves. Policy debates in Washington shifted almost immediately from how to remove Maduro to what to do with both him and his country. On one track, Justice Department lawyers prepared for a complex trial in New York, invoking precedents like the Noriega case and the U.S. Supreme Court's willingness to allow prosecutions of defendants abducted abroad, even when the manner of capture raised international law objections. On another track, foreign policy officials revisited long-standing frameworks for democratic transition, sanctions relief, and energy sector reform, seeking to leverage the leverage now created by Maduro's absence without deepening Venezuela's humanitarian crisis. Internationally, legal scholars and diplomats dissected the raid as a watershed moment. Inside Venezuela, the medium-term aftermath was defined by uncertainty rather than immediate transformation. The interim leadership struggled to assert control over the security forces and state enterprises, even as factions within the ruling party and military quietly recalculated their positions in light of Maduro's absence and the possibility of sanctions relief in exchange for concessions. Opposition figures who had once rallied behind Guaido debated how closely to align with a transition process heavily shaped by Washington, wary that being seen as too closely tied to a foreign-imposed change could delegitimize their role in the eyes of Venezuelan society. For ordinary Venezuelans, the structural problems that had driven millions to leave inflation, shortages, crumbling infrastructure did not vanish with the capture of a single man. While some humanitarian channels expanded and discussions about reconfiguring sanctions gained momentum, the country remained mired in economic dysfunction and political fragmentation. Its future depended on whether internal actors could turn a shock delivered from outside into a genuinely inclusive process of reconstruction. And as diplomats argued in New York and analysts updated their models in Washington, Caracas, and beyond, a quieter question emerged among scholars of war and international law: whether Operation Absolute Resolve was an anomaly born of a particular moment and leader, or a sign of a new era in which powerful states would feel increasingly entitled to use precision violence to resolve what they define as criminal problems across borders. Operation Absolute Resolve closed one chapter of Venezuela's crisis and opened a new one in the history of intervention. In the space of a few hours, a leader who had survived protests, sanctions, coup plots, and economic collapse was taken from his own bedroom and delivered into the custody of a foreign power, not through negotiation or exile, but through the direct application of distant force and intimate violence. In Latin American memory, the images of Maduro in handcuffs immediately evoked older footage of Manuel Noriega being flown out of Panama in 1989. Yet the differences mattered as much as the similarities. Noriega's removal followed a large-scale invasion and occupation. Maduro's came through a surgical raid preceded by strikes and justified as the execution of a criminal warrant. The message, however, was familiar, that when its leaders decide vital interests are at stake, the United States may still choose to act unilaterally and to let legal arguments follow events rather than precede them. For international law and the post-1945 order, the operation landed like a stone in still water, sending concentric ripples across doctrines that had long sought to separate war from law enforcement. Critics warned that abducting a sitting head of state under cover of airstrikes eroded the basic protections that make diplomacy possible, and that other powers, authoritarian or otherwise, would now feel freer to cloak their own cross-border seizures in the language of justice. Supporters countered that the rules had already been bent by regimes that weaponized sovereignty to shield criminal activity, and that in a world of transnational networks, rigid non-intervention could become an alibi for inaction. On a more human scale, the raid distilled many of the contradictions of 21st-century conflict into a single night. A superpower marshaled satellites, drones, AI systems, and elite troops to reach one man, while millions of people living under his rule faced the same shortages, blackouts, and insecurity the next morning. For Venezuelans who celebrated the operation, felt like the removal of an immovable obstacle. For those who mourned or feared it, it confirmed the vulnerability of small states in a world where power still speaks with weapons as much as with words. In the end, the capture of Nicolás Maduro did not resolve the deeper question at the heart of Venezuela. Story or of international politics, who gets to decide and by what right? Operation Absolute Resolve demonstrated how far technology, intelligence, and will can reach, but it left open whether such reach can rebuild institutions, heal societies, or create a more stable order in Venezuela or anywhere else touched by the long shadow of force.